Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and today is episode 3 of my series, The Formation of the United States of America, Shays Rebellion. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Secretary of Foreign Affairs John Jay had failed to negotiate a treaty with Spain that would open New Orleans to Americans, forcing farmers and planters in the western region to transport their crops on poor roads to the Atlantic ports. The failure to conclude a treaty with Spain had confirmed to many American political leaders that the Articles of Confederation were fatally flawed, and a more powerful federal government was required. The main debate concerned the degree of change to the Articles. Hoping to build a closer union, James Madison won approval for a convention to be held at Annapolis, Maryland to resolve protectionist trade barriers. Delegates from 5 states arrived, and since they shared Madison's thinking, they ended the convention and called for a larger convention to be held at Philadelphia next year, but there was no guarantee that it would be more productive. While many politicians agreed that the Confederation of States was flawed, the states seemed unlikely to achieve closer integration unless they were faced with a threat. And that threat appeared in Massachusetts in early 1787, when communities in the western part of the state revolted. The spark was news that the Massachusetts legislature had once again refused to deal with petitions from small communities asking for help with the lack of hard currency required to pay taxes. In addition, backcountry delegates pressed to move the capital west from Boston because Boston delegates could save on expenses during lengthy sessions by living at home and were able to manage their personal affairs, but backcountry delegates could do neither. Aside from the location of the state capital, backcountry delegates viewed the current constitution as unfair. Why had backcountry delegates agreed to such an unequal constitution in the first place? The simple answer is they had not. The Massachusetts Constitution had been drafted during the winter of 1780, the worst winter in generations. Since travel was nearly impossible, almost all of the few delegates who did attend the convention came from the region near Boston, so they gave the governor extensive powers and greatly increased the property requirements to hold office. In particular, voting rights were tied to property, eliminating widespread male suffrage. Naturally, this new constitution was heavily criticized in the western part of the state since it permitted taxation without representation. The consequences of the new constitution became clear when the government handled the pressing issue of enormous debts by agreeing to pay the full value of notes issued during the war, even though their actual value had declined greatly. In theory, this policy would benefit the soldiers who had received the notes, but they had long since sold them to speculators, often for 1/10 of their value. 80% of state debt was held by speculators living in Boston, and they were very influential in state politics. That influence ensured that the legislature decided to repay the speculators quickly, so it introduced a property tax and a poll tax on males 16 years and older to be paid in hard currency, which was rare in the backcountry. The two taxes were expected to raise 90% of the required revenue and would require state assessors to poke around farms to properly evaluate their value. At least, that was the plan. But farmers were spared the burden of the property tax and the poll tax because Governor John Hancock did not implement the invasive tax collection system. While he was a wealthy Boston merchant, Hancock had pursued a political career based on popularity, and he understood that the taxes would be very, very, very unpopular. However, Hancock was suffering from gout, so he decided not to stand for re-election in 1785. James Baldwin had repeatedly lost to Hancock in previous elections and still failed to win a majority even without Hancock as an opponent, but he finally became governor after the contested election was decided by the state senate. The lack of popular support is easily explained. Baldwin was a landowner and speculator who was backed by merchants and speculators, lacking any political sense. He tried to collect all of the taxes due, even though many people could never pay it in 5 years or a decade. Meanwhile, Democratic elements had won control of the legislature of nearby Rhode Island, introducing paper money and a land bank. The new legislature forced speculators to accept payment of 1/4 of the value of the notes and in paper money, not hard currency. The wealthy in Boston viewed this situation with horror and feared that the Rhode Island virus would spread to their state. They were right to be afraid, since the backcountry region was already brimming with discontent. The men who ran the towns in western Massachusetts were called selectmen, responsible for overseeing the education of children and planning the construction of bridges and roads. They were selected each spring by secret ballot during an annual town meeting. Officially, a minimum amount of wealth was required to vote, but all male inhabitants were allowed to vote and serve regardless of wealth. Selectmen in many towns had lost patience with the state government and held county-wide conventions in the end of July. These conventions called for the abolition of the upper house of the legislature and the revision of the electoral process for the lower house. It is important to point out that these conventions were organized by the leading members of local communities, including former officers in the Continental Army. Angered by the increasing number of farms being seized by the courts for non-payment of tax, hundreds of men from nearby communities marched to Northampton on August 29th and prevented court from being held. Naturally, this caught the attention of the state government. Apparently, the revolution had changed little in the state, since the state government followed the example of its royal predecessor and attempted to suppress this insurrection rather than try to understand its causes. Theoretically, they could call out the militia, but there was a slight problem. Namely, the men causing the disturbance were the local militia. When Chief Justice Artemus Ward, a former general during the Revolution, was heckled at Worcester, the militia was called out, but the men refused to serve. It soon became clear that the government had a major problem. When Major General John Peterson led 1,000 men to protect the court in a town near the western edge of the state, someone suggested a vote over the closure of the court, and nearly 800 men left Peterson to side with the rebels. Oddly, for a former patriot, Sam Adams called for the insurgents to be hung. However, the state government adopted a more measured approach, extending the due date for taxes by several months and granting indemnity to the rioters if they pledged allegiance to the state by January 1st. Otherwise, captured rioters would be jailed and whipped. However, these laws made no impression on backcountry militias, and veterans in particular proved unwilling to serve with the state militia. Recognizing that the local militia could not handle the situation, the state government announced on January 4th that it would recruit an army to be commanded by Benjamin Lincoln, a former major general in the Continental Army. Since the legislature had not been consulted, it would not pay for the men. Instead, the funding came from wealthy businessmen. Half of the 153 backers of Lincoln's army were speculators. So, the speculators, who had used their influence to create heavy taxes basically for their own benefit, then paid for a private army to defeat the revolt caused by their taxes. In the end, Lincoln only managed to recruit 3,000 men, but the use of a private army raised fears of standing armies, the traditional enforcement of monarchies. By this time, III-Shays had joined the insurgents and commanded one of the largest groups, so he became the perceived leader, which is why it is called Shays' Revolt. As a veteran, he saw the need for better weapons and attempted to capture the arsenal at Springfield on January 25th, but the attack failed after cannon fire killed 4 men and wounded many others. Roughly a week later, Lincoln led his men through a blizzard to catch Shays' men asleep at the small town of Petersham on the morning of February 3rd. Faced with cannon, the rebels melted into the countryside and most made their way home, basically ending the revolt. That same day, the legislature declared a state of rebellion and authorized the state treasurer to borrow money to pay for the army. So the wealthy speculators would be reimbursed and public money would pay for the army. So the wealthy speculators would be reimbursed and public money would pay for a private army. Actually, Lincoln's army had dissolved after enlistments ended on February 21st. Fortunately, the rebel army had melted away as well. Meanwhile, the rebel leaders sought allies. Revolutionary War hero Ethan Allen of nearby Vermont was offered command since he had criticized the government of Massachusetts, but he declined the offer. Representatives even traveled to Quebec and met with British Governor Lord Dorchester, but did not receive any real support. Determined to punish the rebels, the legislature passed the Disqualification Act, which prevented rebels from serving on juries, holding town offices, and voting in elections for 3 years. Most rebels were allowed to go home if they surrendered their weapons, took an oath of allegiance, and paid a small fine. The disqualification was viewed as an attempt to prevent the governor's opponents from voting in the April 1787 election, but Baldwin was still beaten 3-1 by John Hancock, who wanted his old job back. The new legislature restored suffrage to 4,000 Shays sites, excluding rebel leaders and former militia officers. A state court traveled from county to county over a period of 2 months, but only 2 men were hung among 18 death sentences, several hundred indictments, and 4,000 confessions of wrongdoing. Most likely, the government realized the danger of creating martyrs among men popular in their local communities. The confessions are why we actually know something about the rebels, since survivors of failed revolts generally try to avoid revealing their identities. At least 30 former officers of the Continental Army had joined the rebels. While it would be natural to presume that the weight of massive debts had driven men to revolt, that presumption would be incorrect. Admittedly, both Shays and Luke Day, another rebel leader and former captain in the Continental Army, had gone into debt, but they were atypical. In fact, 3 of Shays' creditors were fellow rebel leaders, and the majority of the 1,800 Hampshire County rebels who swore oaths of allegiance after the revolt had never been debtors. Since most rebels were not debtors, what triggered the revolt? Basically, anger at the new state government's blatant attempt to enrich a small group of people at the cost of the rest of society. Moreover, most towns in the western counties produced few, if any, rebels. 4/5 of the rebels came from only 45 of the 187 towns of the 5 counties where courts were shut down. These towns were actually populated by extended families, so the revolt was really a series of coordinated revolts by large families of fathers, sons, brothers, uncles, and cousins, which reflected generations of marriage alliances and a tiny bit of inbreeding. Many of these families already held offices in their towns, which meant they were well off or even wealthy. Why was the revolt confined to a few towns? Simple. The leaders of the revolt had no reputation outside of their clan networks, so they could not attract recruits from other towns. After Shays' rebellion broke out, Secretary of War Henry Knox inspected the region and claimed that the rebels wanted to overturn society, paid little taxes, owned no property, and could raise 15,000 men. He was wrong on all counts, which is honestly embarrassing for a Secretary of War. The distorted view of reality was unsurprising since Knox's wife had inherited a huge part of southeastern Maine, making him one of the wealthiest men in New England, so he naturally interacted with other wealthy people and shared their concerns. While the governors of neighboring states, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and New York, promised to arrest any rebels who fled to their states, Vermont Governor Thomas Chittenden merely said that he would see what he could do. Chittenden duly issued a proclamation ordering Vermonters to not harbor any rebels, but he does not seem to have made any actual effort to arrest them, even though Shays and 3 other leaders were staying at the farm next to his farm. They were not the only ones. Roughly 4,000 rebels and their families sold everything they could and fled to Vermont. Although the revolt had been crushed, the speculators saw their potentially lucrative payout disappear because the new legislature of 1787 passed a moratorium on debts and slashed direct taxes, switching to indirect taxes. Worse, Revenue from indirect taxes no longer paid interest on state notes but paid general state expenses. This change in approach greatly reduced the tax burden on backcountry towns. A side effect of the fall in the value of state debts was that speculators now pressed for a more powerful federal government that would assume and pay the state debt. Less than 10 people had died in total, and the actual revolt had lasted for 2 months. Despite its failure, the revolt had repercussions in New York, where vast estates were controlled by a few families. The Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the Cortlandts, and the Phillipses, who acted like feudal barons. These land barons were angered by the Republic of Vermont's refusal to recognize the property rights of speculators from nearby states, and the availability of cheap land was attracting people from states with stricter property laws, so they had pressed for an invasion of next-door Vermont. To his credit, Alexander Hamilton realized that an invasion might drive the independent-minded Republic to ally with the British, serving as a refuge for more revolts like Shays. So he introduced a bill in the New York Assembly in March 1787, directing New York's delegates in Congress to support statehood for Vermont. Governor Clinton remained opposed, probably due to his rivalry with Philip Schuyler, Hamilton's father-in-law. Allen and Chittenden had kept Vermont neutral during Shays' revolt, so the majority of the assembly accepted giving up New York's claims to Vermont. Actually, Hamilton's efforts in the New York Assembly had started at the same time that Shays had sent envoys offering Ethan Allen command of the revolt. Allen was not a young man, so the prospect of a peaceful solution to Vermont's problem was probably more attractive than the brief glory of command of a revolt that would likely end with him standing on the gallows with a rope around his neck, so he publicly refused the offer. Shays' rebellion had lacked a leadership that could coordinate unrest in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. Still, Ethan Allen continued to lobby British officials in Canada for better trading concessions, since petitions to Congress had repeatedly failed. In the end, Vermont would join whichever nation granted it statehood. While it is hard to know for certain, the revolt likely encouraged state legislatures to send delegates to the convention at Philadelphia. The proposal to hold a bigger convention at Philadelphia reached the state legislatures in the fall, around the same time as news that large groups of armed men were preventing courts from operating in Massachusetts, although open fighting did not occur until January. The proposed convention was unanimously endorsed by the Virginia legislature and approved by the New Jersey legislature in November, followed by Pennsylvania in December. However, New York was very reluctant, as were the New England states. Only 7 states had appointed delegates by February, when Congress finally achieved quorum. It soon endorsed the convention, which probably encouraged most of the remaining states to appoint delegations, so the convention would proceed. To sum up, when the legislature of Massachusetts imposed heavy taxes that would only benefit a small group of already wealthy speculators, it sparked a brief revolt. While the uprising was nearly bloodless, the failure of the militia to defeat the revolt made members of legislatures in other states reconsider the value of sending delegates to attend the convention in Philadelphia to discuss a stronger government. Still, there was no guarantee that all of the delegates shared similar goals, and I will discuss how they resolved their differences next episode. Thanks for listening.